Have you ever wondered what happens when the doors of a school bus close and it drives into the unknown? What if there was something far darker waiting for the children inside? The school bus had always been a symbol of safety for Cedarwood students. It was the bright yellow beacon that ensured children got to school and home again, despite the darkness that loomed on the edges of their town. Mrs. Campbell, the driver, was a fixture in their daily lives. Everyone knew her by name, from the youngest first graders to the seniors, and she had driven this same route for years. That day, the sky hung low with thick gray clouds. It was the kind of weather that made everything feel heavier. The bus had just finished its last pickup, and Mrs. Campbell adjusted her rearview mirror, taking a quick glance at the children settling in for the ride home. It had been an exhausting day for everyone, and the kids, like usual, were eager to go home. The bus rumbled to life as the engine turned over, and they began their journey along Route 23. The road, framed by tall oaks and pine trees, stretched ahead into the thickening fog. Mrs. Campbell always joked that this was the kind of weather that made the town feel like it was slipping into another time, an eerie world where things didn't quite make sense. But today, something felt off. The fog seemed thicker, darker, more suffocating than usual. It wrapped around the bus like a blanket, dimming the streetlights and blotting out the horizon. The children's chatter softened as the miles passed, their voices barely audible above the hum of the engine. "Why is the road so dark today?" Emma asked, looking up from her book, her eyes wide with concern. Mrs. Campbell looked out the front window, squinting through the haze. "Must be a storm coming in," she muttered, though she didn't remember seeing any weather alerts that morning. The road ahead was still familiar, but somehow the landmarks seemed distorted. The old bakery they passed every day was now shrouded in shadow, its windows empty and hollow. The little convenience store by the corner appeared abandoned, its door swinging in the wind. Suddenly, a sharp metallic clank echoed through the bus, followed by a loud screech of brakes. "What's happening?" Brian, the class clown, shouted from the back, his voice shaky. Mrs. Campbell's knuckles tightened around the steering wheel. "Hold on, kids," she said, her voice cracking. "Something's wrong. Stay seated." The bus swerved to the right, as if pulled by some unseen force, and veered off the main road. Mrs. Campbell slammed the brakes, sending the children forward, their bodies jostling against their seats. Outside, the fog thickened even more, and the road seemed to stretch unnaturally, winding through trees that were now unfamiliar. The GPS screen on the dashboard flickered and went black. "We've got to get back on the main road," Mrs. Campbell muttered to herself, her panic rising. But when she tried to reverse, the bus's wheels refused to turn. The bus was now fully stopped, and a thick silence had overtaken the air. The children sat frozen, their eyes glued to the windows. It was Sophie who saw it first, a shadow darting across the edge of the fog, moving in an unnatural way, too fast, too precise. "Did you see that?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. The others turned their heads, trying to catch a glimpse, but whatever it was gone. "I didn't see anything," Brian scoffed, though his usual cocky attitude had evaporated. The next thing they noticed was the figure standing in the middle of the road. A child, about the same age as the younger ones on the bus, was standing still, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Mrs. Campbell's heart skipped a beat as she gazed out the window. The child's clothes were tattered, her face obscured by long tangled hair. What struck Mrs. Campbell was the eerie stillness. The girl didn't move, didn't even blink. "I need to check this out," Mrs. Campbell said, though she didn't want to. "No, don't go," Emma pleaded. But Mrs. Campbell was already opening the door. The fog rushed in, cold and damp, As she stepped onto the road, the figure didn't react to her approach. "Hey, are you okay?" Mrs. Campbell asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The child slowly lifted her head, revealing eyes black as the deepest night. "I'm lost," the girl said, her voice a raspy whisper. Before Mrs. Campbell could respond, the girl opened her mouth, but instead of words, an otherworldly scream erupted from her throat, a sound so high-pitched and filled with torment that it shattered the stillness. Mrs. Campbell froze, a cold shiver running down her spine. The girl pointed toward the bus with a bony finger, her eyes unblinking. "Go back," the girl hissed, her voice no longer human. "They're waiting for you." Terrified, Mrs. Campbell stumbled backward, slamming the bus door behind her. She fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling as she turned the ignition. The engine sputtered, and for a moment, the bus sat motionless, its lights flickering. "We need to go," Emma cried. With a roar, the engine came to life, and Mrs. Campbell slammed her foot on the gas pedal. The bus lurched forward, its headlights cutting through the dense fog. But no matter how fast she drove, it seemed like the road never ended. The trees closed in, their branches scraping the sides of the bus like bony fingers. "Why is the road changing?" Brian shouted. "We passed that sign already." It was true. The familiar landmarks they had passed earlier were repeating, as though the bus was trapped in some kind of loop. The same bend in the road, the same broken fence. They kept coming back. The bus began to shake, its wheels screeching against the gravel. The temperature inside plummeted, and the air felt like ice. The children huddled together in fear, their faces pale. Then the whispers began, low, guttural, almost indistinguishable, but unmistakably clear. "Step off the bus. Come play with us. Come stay." The children covered their ears, but the voices grew louder, more insistent. One by one, the kids stood, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. Sophie was the only one who remained seated, her body trembling in fear. "Don't go," she whispered, clutching the seat in front of her. "Don't listen to them." But it was too late. The first child stepped off the bus. It was Emma. The moment her foot touched the ground, her body crumbled into dust, her scream echoing through the woods like a fading memory. One by one, the children followed, each one vanishing into the fog. Sophie screamed, but no sound came out. She was paralyzed, unable to move. And then, as quickly as it had all begun, the fog parted. The bus, with its remaining passengers, was back on Route 23, the road stretching out into the bright morning light. The children were gone, their seats now empty. Mrs. Campbell pulled the bus to a stop at the last stop, her heart racing. She turned to the children, only they were no longer children. Their faces had aged decades overnight, their eyes sunken and hollow. Their once bright spirits had vanished. The parents arrived, their faces filled with confusion and horror. When they saw their children, their eyes widened with shock. The children could not remember what had happened on that bus, but the fear was written on their faces. Mrs. Campbell never drove again. The bus was never seen again either, as if it had never existed. But some say if you travel down Route 23 on a foggy night, you might still hear the sound of whispers on the wind. And if you listen closely, you might hear the screech of a school bus, forever lost in the fog, searching for its next passengers. What would you do if you found yourself trapped on that bus, surrounded by the whispers of the unknown? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Shadow Stories for more spine-chilling tales from the dark corners of reality.